What? My dongle? Yes, evidently my dongle is working. I don't think so.
I go to my aunt's.
I'm glad.
They're black boys.
I'm glad.
Yeah, one of my cousins picks me up.
Good. Good. Pardon? Yep. Hello all. I think we're still coming in a little bit. I think a lot about these things. And I think it's important to reiterate that I have for the last 10 years taught a historical critical approach. Critical not being a negative, not being like criticizing, but a historical critical process that looks at what we have to work with, in light of the fact that these documents they were written a long time ago, mostly in the first century, the latter half of the first century, and it's what we have. But they are also reflections of the time in which they were written, and those times are not the same in many ways than the times we live in. And so that becomes important to remember and to recall that these were not written to be in a volume. These are collections of documents that were written that eventually 400 years later, 350 years later, made their way into what we call the Christian canon. But they were all written independently. The Gospels were written by 4 communities of Christians, scattered. They were not connected with one another. And so they represent the mind and the development of this early form of religion, of worship that came out of Judaism. But through Paul, it exploded in the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world, along with all that world contained as its traditions. And so there's so much to remember about when and how they were written in their time. So we're going to move on here. All right, imagine a teacher in 2001 at the beginning of her career having a student hand in an original story assignment, right? It's an assignment, all the students hand in theirs, and this student hands in theirs, all right? Timeline, 2001 story, okay? It's a document that someone wrote, and it exists. And imagine this same teacher discovering that another student has handed in a near identical paper of the same assignment 16 years later. You understand? Now, the teacher remembered and went back in her files and said, whoa, that means something. How it happened, we don't know, but 16 years later, 90% of what was in the original paper is in the second assignment 16 years later. The second paper, as I just said, contains 90%, near word for word and chronologically identical to the previous paper. Tell me, anybody, what would you surmise? Plagiarism. That the second one got a hold of it somehow and used it, okay? So now we have a source. That's the original paper. 16 years later, we have a copy of that, and it appears. And the teacher, notice 7 years pass. The teacher, the same teacher, discovers that yet another student has handed in a near identical paper of the same assignment 23 years after that. Okay? And what would you say about that? Probably the same thing. Word for word, chronologically identical to the original paper. Now we have source, copy A, and copy B. That makes sense, doesn't it? Our minds can get we can get our head around that. What if the historical dates are actually these? 70, 86, and 93 in the first century of the Common Era. We start to get a little wiggly, don't we? The other one we didn't have a problem with, but we might start to have problems with this. Welcome to the Synoptic Gospels. How many have heard of the term Synoptic Gospels? Hands. Okay? Yeah, most. How many is it new? Hands that it's brand new. Okay, great, thank you. Synoptic, syn in Greek, means together. Okay? Together. Optikos means seen. Together seen, but really more for us seen together. Synoptic, these are seen together. You would agree that the original paper and the copy A and copy B, they are seen together in this case. Seen together. At issue are three Jesus communities, each producing their own gospel narrative, yet each containing majority amounts of material that is near word for word and chronologically identical. We haven't established yet which is the first one. Let's say we haven't dated them yet, but we've got three that have contained vast amounts of exactly word for word and chronologically the same material. And the likelihood of coincidence, wouldn't you agree, is rather nil. I think any teacher, when the kid says, well, the kid's parents say, well, Johnny would never do that. It's just a coincidence that he wrote word for word the same as Nellie's paper. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't go for that. Coincidence is not likely. The sheer volume is way too big. It's huge, the amount of material that is near identical and in the same order. Clearly, one of the three Gospels is the source material for the other two. One is the source. Neither of the later Gospels are related to each other. They're not connected. They're separate, all right? So each had, independently of each other, gotten a hold of a copy of the source, each of them. How do we know that? Because it's near identical. The challenge is finding which gospel came first, which appeared second, and which third. Written immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans in 70, Mark is the source gospel. It's our earliest gospel. It's written first, and it contains all of this material. Now, two other gospels get a hold of this over time, and shifting from oral to written, Mark is soon being copied and shared with other Jesus communities. How else is a copy going to get somewhere else? It has to get, we know of two communities that it got to. Maybe it got to more. But these two communities embraced it. A fully separate community would be undergoing the challenges of Christians continuing to live among Jews within the synagogue. Mind you, this is after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and Judaism, as it had existed, is no more. Rabbinic Judaism, which is born out of the Pharisaic tradition, strict adherence to the law, saves Judaism throughout the diaspora and the Mediterranean basin. And they are redefining themselves, Jews are, and in amongst them are all of these Messianic Jews. And it is getting to be a problem, a big problem. Because the Messianic Jews are saying, you're all wrong. We're right, you're wrong. We're fulfilled, and you're not. The Jews fighting for a new post-temple survival have very little patience with these always troublesome Jesus followers. Be a Jew or get out. Or get out. That's our Matthean. That's our Matthean gospel. It is written before this schism in 88. The language you've heard before that Matthew is really talking to the Jews. Basically saying, can't we just get along? That's Bruce's phrase. Now fully ejected from the synagogue, a third community would be coming to terms with living apart from what they thought was also theirs. All right? Like any losing side in a church split, they're angry and turn viciously against the Jews. How many of you have experienced a church split? Is it ugly? It gets really ugly. And the losing side that no longer is welcome in the building they thought was always theirs too, they're angry about it. They're angry about it. And so our third synoptic is the Lucan gospel. And exactly the same process has occurred. They each have gotten a hold of a copy of Mark, liked it, incorporated it, and added their own unique material that has developed since the Markan time that's unique to their communities. Rachel didn't like the term Jesus communities. For some reason it bothered her, this idea that these were little pockets of Jews, little pockets of Jews, of Christians, all over the diaspora. And none of them are in Judah. Mind you, Rome's booted them all out because as far as Rome was concerned, they were Jews, the early Christians. They're gone. They are no more there. So it's way out in the Greco-Roman world and as far south in Egypt as Elephantine. It's all in that whole region, but it's not in Judah. It's not in Jerusalem. That is cut off from them. Later, this harsh language towards the Jews would, in the Johannine, the John Gospel, see Jesus actively condemning the Jews as devil followers. It has Jesus saying, God is not your father is the devil. Wow, this gets so ugly. And this language would go on to calling the Jews Christ killers, and Martin Luther got on board that. He hated the Jews, Martin Luther did. And so that then is going to shift all the way into Germany in the last century. Pogroms in Russia, this sense of enmity for the Jews for having been Christ killers. It's historical. Gosh, it's so old, all of this stuff. Much of the early church's sense of intense persecution comes from this period. It comes from this period. Suffering for the faith. And it is expanded. We get a lot of language of this, of that you suffer for the faith. It comes from this period. It's a hard time for the early church. None of the New Testament materials were written in Judea, in Jerusalem, or in Hebrew. They're all Greek in a Greco-Roman world, in Greco-Roman communities, nowhere near Jerusalem, where all of this is supposed to have happened. After the fall and destruction of Jerusalem to the Romans in 70, the Jews and the early Christian sect within Judaism were dispersed from Judea throughout the Mediterranean. It's important to get your head around the fact that we're not talking about things like The Robe, movies that's all taking place in Jerusalem. It's not that. These are little plant communities of Jesus followers in lots of little places. Further establishing the Markan gospel as the source for the later two gospels is important. Fortunately for academic scholars, the Markan author is the least proficient in Koine Greek. You can identify the Markan texts so well because he's clunky. He's really clunky. Matthew is a much more refined Greek speaker and Greek writer than Mark was. Yes? Clunky? Awkward. Awkward. Luke is not as respectful as Matthew is to the Markan texts. Luke finds a lot he cuts to the chase. He's a much bigger editor. He'll compress things down, but the language is still there. But he dumps whole things that really, it's you want to say to the Markan author, why did you write that? They didn't make any sense. There's lots of places like this. The Matthean author is significantly more skilled than the Markan, but remains respectful of the Markan effort. And that really holds true. Mark 2:13 and 14. This is Mark. And he went out again by the seashore, and all the people were coming to him, and he was teaching them. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Remember that? The son of Alphaeus. Who was the son of Alphaeus before? James was the son of Alphaeus. But now it's Levi is the son of Alphaeus, sitting in a tax office. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he, Levi, got up and followed him. Does that sound familiar? Sounds very familiar. I'm sure you've heard that and read it a lot of times. Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, see how he compressed? All that stuff about the seashore, people came in, they went out. He just says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's office. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. The name's been changed. Name's been changed. Luke, same passage, because they're working with Mark, right? They're working with that. After that, he went out and looked at a tax collector named Levi. He's not the son of Alphaeus, and he's not Matthew. So far we've got 2 Levi's and 1 Matthew. And he said to him, "Follow me," and he left everything behind, and he got up and began following him. Now that all sounds really much the same, doesn't it? It sounds quite the same. We're going to do this. It's called mapping. Here's the Markan, all right? Here's the Matthean. Lucan. And that whole section that was below, it was all superfluous Markan. Neither used it at all. Markan continues. Luke, Levi. All right? Matthew, a man called Matthew. Totally unique. Why is the Matthean community using Matthew for this? Well, one might say because it's Matthew, right? But in none of the Gospels do they ever use first person. Whenever the Matthean author is writing about Matthew, he says, he saw, he went, he asked, a man called Matthew. He never says I. Mark continues, all 3 continues, it's identical. Once we get through this stuff in there, it's all absolutely word for word identical in all 3. Okay? So that's rather clear, except Luke continues a little bit. He left everything behind. Nobody else says that. And then the end is, again, identical, word for word. Now, I own 2 books, actually I found a third, that map out side by side and in order the synoptic Gospels we know as Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They're great books. They're great books. You have one, don't you? Yeah. And then it maps out everything in the synoptics in this fashion. And I whipped through that, but I just wanted you to see a little bit like that. The example I've mapped is by intention short, but it makes the point pretty well. Would you not agree that they're the same? They're the same. That which is common to all 3 is near identical. Chronologically, they're nearly always the same. They happen in the same place. 1, 2, and 3. As I've stated before, 90% of the Markan material is embedded in the Matthean Gospel and 65% within the Lucan. 90% of Mark is in Matthew. Luke is a greater editor, 65%. It's no accident that the Markan content and chronology is as identifiable as they clearly are. This isn't hard to do. It's not hard to do. And yet there are differences. Not only the tidying up of a respectful Matthean author or the more freely editorial from the Lucan author, there are significant changes and additional material as well. There's more stuff in there. Mark. Jesus began to teach in the synagogue, and the many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man learn these things? What is this wisdom that has been given to him, and such miracles as these performed by his hands?" Where is this happening? In Galilee. He's gone home. So you know where this is going to end up, right? So mapping it out. This is Mark. This is Matthew. Near identical. Two words. Luke doesn't use it at all. He's not interested. This didn't rate for the Lucan author. He didn't need this. Matthew did for a good reason. So, Mark, Matthew, almost identical. Almost identical. These are our sections. Mark, here's where it gets problematic, and we've covered this. But this is very important. You see the difference? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this the carpenter's son? His mother's name is Mary. Isn't this Mary's son? Doesn't sound like much. It's massive. It's massive. And Luke, of course, is not there. And the brother of, again, we're going to get our brothers named, right? And that's going to happen as well in Matthew. And we're going to have our sisters who don't get names, right? They don't get names. And then everybody took offense at him. But Matthew has made a change. His respect for Mark can only go so far. And he's made a very significant change in all of this. And I think that's why he kept this one in. We've already touched on this. Is this not the carpenter's son of Mary? No, it's no father implied. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not named Mary? Now we have a father. Mark, maybe as honest as he was, or he didn't have the concern for, he just wrote what he wrote. And he says that Jesus doesn't have a father. That's not a good thing. Even if your father's dead, you're still your father's son. So it implies illegitimacy. In the Matthean, he straightens it out. He changes it. Is this not the carpenter's son? These are two very different statements. And suddenly, we have invented Joseph, right? He's not the carpenter. Someone else unnamed is the carpenter. The Matthean author has invented a father for us. Therefore, solved this problem of illegitimacy, which you can't have, right? It's not good if you're a growing religion in the Greco-Roman world. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not named Mary? The carpenter's son. It's a little apostrophe S. It's a tiny, minuscule change, but it has huge, huge results. Enter Joseph, a Matthean invention. Matthew. Now, the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, right? Before they came together, she was found to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Joseph, a righteous man who did not want to disgrace her, planned to send her away secretly. He's going to get rid of her. So let's be clear. There is no Joseph in either the Markan or the Johannine Gospels, the first and the last. There's no Joseph. Out of necessity, such a figure appears only in the second and third of the Synoptic Gospels, as only they contain birth narratives. There is no birth narrative in Mark and John. These are inventions only in these two later Synoptic Gospels. Where did Jesus' birth story originate? No idea. Have no idea. But it's natural that one would, isn't there? I mean, there are Gospels that didn't make it in of Jesus as a child, you know? And he, like any child, he doesn't have control over his powers of life and death, and so he makes some mistakes, you know? Kills some things. And is rebuked by someone for it. The Gospel of Jesus as a child. It's kind of like the reliquaries of the skull of John the Baptist as a child. I think that's funny. Let's see how these two narratives, birth narratives, compare. Envision the many Christmas pageants you've seen. You've seen a jillion, haven't you? Or those creches. We had several in my house that you've owned or seen, okay? Looks like this, doesn't it? Boy, that's a crowd, right? It's a mashup. It's a mashup. Let's see how the two narratives compare. Okay? Matthew and Luke. Baby Jesus, Virgin Mary, fiancé Joseph. Common to both. They both have them. It's the only thing that's the same. Three Weisenheimers. Matthew, right? And the gifts. It's only Matthew. The night shepherds, right? There were shepherds abiding in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. Recitative for the Messiah. Night shepherds, only in Luke. Okay? Angel, it's only in Luke. The star, only in Matthew. Only in Matthew. Animals, which are in our creches and things like that, but really it signifies a manger. Outside. It's outside in a like a barn or a cave or a cattle stall or something. And that's what we get in those. But they live in a house when the three wise men comes. Jesus has been born. He's probably 4 or 5 years old, or at least 3. And the three wise men, they find him there. It's not where he was born. He probably lives in the 3-story walk-up or something like that. But if you read your Bibles, you will note these differences. So what we have on our Christmas pageants and our creches, they're mashups of 2 Gospels all shoved together. But they're not the same. They're not. Bethlehem. Well, they don't even live in the same place. Okay? In Matthew, they live in Bethlehem. In Luke, they live in Nazareth. Of all the components of a Christmas pageant, only the Holy Family are both Matthean and Lucan. In Luke, an archangel shares the news to Mary. In Matthew, an angel shares the news to Joseph. Other than the central 3 figures, the Lucan and Matthean Gospels agree on nothing else. These are 2 utterly separate birth narratives of Jesus. They don't relate to anything other than the Holy Family. They are separate documents. The family doesn't even live in the same town. To quote Dr. Bart Ehrman, it all depends on which gospel you read. I'm not saying they're both wrong, but one of them is. They can't both be right. They both can't be right. The Matthean and Lucan Gospels were written independently of each other. They weren't written by 2 authors at the same table, each doing their best. They didn't go to Jesus conferences or conventions every 5 years and show their work. These are separate communities, separate authors. The only thing they have in common is they each got a copy of Mark. But somehow they both had this gospel. All right? The gospel according to Matthew and of Luke, 90% inside. That's a huge amount that's contained within. The Markan gospel within Luke is 65%. That's still a lot. Uniquely Matthean material is 27%. Uniquely Lucan material is 35%. And then there's something else. Something else, and it's another source. Because there's a whole pile of other identical languages, even chronologically, within both that aren't Markan. The Matthean and Lucan Gospels were written independently of each other, and yet each contains significant materials that indicate a common source, and that we've established is Markan. The chance of so much common material near word for word and chronologically the same can't be ascribed to coincidence. And with so much common material such as, look at all this, and that's not even it. Okay? I needed to fit this into the page. Okay? There's a lot more. And all of these things, I promise you, you are familiar with all of these. I particularly like the rich fool. That's a joke. Material near identical in all three Gospels. That's Markan. This is Markan material. And we've already gone through the rejection in Galilee, okay? What about things near identical in both Matthew and Luke, like these? They're utterly absent in Mark. Did you know that? The Beatitudes are not Markan. They're only in Matthew and Luke. They're not Markan. And these you know very well. So where do they come from? Because they are near identical as well. And that's important. Behaving the same indicates a second source, an additional source, because it acts exactly the same as that which is common to Mark. We just don't have it. But when you have identical stuff, how about this one? Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. That's the Matthean. And here's the Lucan. A little more spare, isn't it? It's just a little bit less. But Luke tends to cut to the chase a little more. He's a little bit more heavy-handed editor. And these are identical. That's enough. Of course, this is not in Mark. It's not in Mark. Continue with Matthew. There's all that, right? And here's Luke. Near identical. Absent in Mark. There's another source. You don't get these things that are word for word the same coincidentally, not at this sheer amount. So look familiar? Do you know that we only use the Matthean version of the Lord's Prayer? We only use that. Have you ever in a church service spoken the Lord's Prayer from the Lucan Gospel? You think you have? I have never. We only use the Matthean. And that's just tradition, isn't it? We use the Matthean. They're very similar. Where do they come from? Isn't that the real question? If they're identical or near identical, they have to come from somewhere. From somewhere. So there's a second source after Mark that behaves in the same way as Mark, but whose material is absent from Mark. This large amount of material is near identical in both the Matthean and the Lucan Gospels. Clearly, there's an additional source that both Gospels had access to, separate from the Markan. Imagine, this is later, this is after 70, and something else is out there making the rounds along with Mark's Gospel. Remember that after Jesus' baptism by John, Jesus is immediately whisked out into the desert. Now this is an interesting one because it involves both the Markan and then vast amounts of additional material. Here's Mark. That's it. The Spirit brought him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by Satan, and he was with wild animals, and the angels were serving him. Tell me what's missing? Temptations. Going to the top of the, throw yourself down, and angels not hit your foot with a stone. There is so much. There's so much missing. It is a Markan story found in both Matthew and Luke. But look at this. This is the sheer volume. Where'd that come from? And the white is the Markan. Now, would you agree that's a lot of material? That's a lot of work. Yeah, just making that slide. And then I'm going to pound it home just a little bit more with this. Look at this. So it doesn't go past you. I made it really teeny tiny. Really, really teeny tiny. There you go. Okay? What is the source of so much material that is identical, the same as Mark is, but it's not Markan? So the Markan source is in white, and the second source is in red in that case. Although Jesus' temptation is mentioned briefly, without any details, early in the Markan Gospel. It's such a tiny thing, wouldn't you agree? And he was being attended by angels, and he was with wild animals. I mean, it's so little, it's so sparse. Both the Matthean and Lucan versions are 5+ times longer with near identical additional details. Where did this much expanded near identical material come from? Where did the Matthean and Lucan Gospels get so much more material beyond the Markan? If material behaves in the same manner as does the Markan material, and yet is absent in the Markan source, there has to be a second source. I've pounded this home over and over again, but I think you might agree. We have another source. So welcome to Q, the second source. Q. It's called Q. Quelle in German is the word for source, shortened to Q. This was highly developed in the German academic communities, biblical academic communities. And it is the second largest source in both the Matthean and Lucan Gospels, after the much larger Markan material. It's huge, the amount of Q, quelle, source material that's inside. It's fully absent in the Markan, and it is real. It just proves themselves. As you can see, both the Matthean and Lucan Gospels are, for the greater part, products of other sources that had made their way to both communities before they produced their own. What did we use the word for the Markan material? Plagiarism. The Q material, if a document came to them, both in their time, and they incorporated and copied it, it is, again, plagiarism. Yes?
Is the Q also the source of the birth narratives in both Gospels?
You know, that is a great question. It could be. It could be. But that doesn't mean it is. But the problem with the narratives is they're not the same at all. They don't use any phrases that are similar. So in that, you have to dispel them. That's a tradition that had gained traction in the early Christian world. And it was delightful, the idea of incorporating the birth of Jesus, okay? Plumbing Isaiah, especially plumbing Isaiah, to have a virgin birth. The problem with the virgin birth is a problem. Isaiah in Hebrew doesn't say virgin. It says a young woman. And in the first translation into another language from the Hebrew of the Old Testament into Greek, they made a mistake and they used the word parthenos in Greek, which means virgin. If it was going to be virgin in the Hebrew, it would have been Bethula, but it's Alma, which means a young woman. You would agree there's a big difference between a young woman giving birth and a virgin giving birth. One involves the supernatural, but it's a translational error. And that is how we know that Matthew didn't read Hebrew, that he read the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Yes, sir, you had your hand.
Maybe I'm jumping the gun, but could Matthew, after copying Mark, embellish that, and then Luke later on just copy what Matthew wrote? Is that a possibility?
You know, that is often put out there, But the problem with that is the editorial nature of the Matthean author for the Markan material is so different that by the time we know that the Lucan author and his style is absolutely his style in dealing with the Markan material. It is so constant that we run into a big problem with the idea that Luke is editing Matthew. Luke is definitely editing Mark. And I don't know if that's a helpful thing, but it is hard to say that it's going from Mark to Matthew and Matthew is going to Luke, because the nature of Luke's editing is so consistent with a source at Mark. If he was editing Matthew, it would not be the same as he's consistent. It's clear that he is editing Mark, not Matthew. Yeah. Let's see, where was I? After incorporation of both the Markan and Q materials, the remaining material that is unique only to the Matthean and only to the Lucan Gospels, while original, make up the least in both. Both communities had, was that a hand? Reverend? I thought you had wisdom to impart. The challenging Markan section solved in the Matthean by changing carpenter to carpenters. The entire section is simply removed in the Lucan. Doesn't rate. Without access to the original Q, we have no idea just how the Matthean and Lucan authors treated the original material in their incorporation. We don't have, like we have Mark to go back to look at from Matthew and Luke, we don't have a copy of Q. All we have is the existence of it by the way they use it, by the way they write it. Based upon the Lord's Prayer in each, it appears nearly the same as we find with the Markan. Okay? It's the same pattern. It's the same way they do it. Perhaps the most uniquely unique of the unique material found in the Matthean Gospel is this. Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. So far, so good, but that's not in Mark. That's not in Mark. This is uniquely Matthean, okay? Many tombs were opened, and bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, that's the term for died, were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection. In other words, they waited in their tombs for 3 days being resurrected, but after Jesus is resurrected, they came out of their tombs, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. How many have had that read to them from your pulpits? Isn't that a monster? That one? Matthew loves earthquakes. He incorporates earthquakes all over the place, and darkness was over the whole world at this time. And now we have these dead people walking into Jerusalem. So let's work through this, okay? At the moment of Jesus' death, the temple veil of the Holy of Holies tears in two. That's totally Matthean. The earthquake immediately occurs and splits rocks. The earthquake opened the Christian tombs where they were laid out, and the corpses were resurrected from the dead. They waited patiently inside until Sunday morning, and they then walked into Jerusalem, seen by many. Boy, don't you think somebody would report that or talk about that somewhere other than one guy? And Luke didn't write about this, and Mark didn't write about it, and John didn't write about it. How'd they miss that? But Matthew, the Matthean community, had their own sense for theater. The word and image of zombies comes to mind, right? I mean, I see this. Oh my gosh, that's awful. It's just awful. I'm sorry, but it's what comes to mind. I've heard everybody, you say the same thing, don't you, Susan? They're zombies. I didn't invent it, it just happens. Yeah, it is. But they came back to life. They're corpses, and they came back to life, and they waited 3 days, and then they walked into Jerusalem. Were they hungry? Thirsty? Going to their favorite coffee shop? It's me, I know I look awful. Naturally, a few questions come to mind. What condition were the resurrected corpses in? You know, did Matthew even work this through? Did they walk into Jerusalem looking like that? Or does resurrection reverse them back to normal? I have no idea. This story is mentioned nowhere else in the New Testament. So this is uniquely unique Matthean. Luke, boy, here's a weird one. There was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. He summoned him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be management." He's fired him. He's on to him, right? That doesn't sound so bad, right? It makes some sense, right? We've started out good. It continues. The manager said to himself, "What am I to do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I know what I will do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes." He's got an idea of how he can, mooch off of other people. When I'm fired, others will welcome me. He's not going to work. He's not going to beg. Luke continues. This just gets worse. He summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 jugs of oil. And he said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. He's doctoring the bill, right? Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 cores of wheat. And he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. He's doctoring. He's making it nice for the people who owe, and he's stealing from the owner. They will owe me for reducing what they owe my master. They'll owe him a favor now. Okay? Now get ready for this. His master complimented him, the unrighteous manager, because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. Who are the sons of light? Christians. I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of the unrighteousness, so that when it is all gone, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. Anybody follow that? I don't get any of that. I read that one over and over again. I read it in other translations. I can't find anything worthy in this one. Why did the master compliment the manager as being shrewd? Oh, I have no idea. Cozy up to the wealthy, because when their money is gone, they will welcome you to heaven? The Lucan section is found nowhere else. What is anybody got the light bulb over your heads for this one? Jan, have you ever preached this? Do you remember this? Do you remember this section? Did you have the same reaction to it as I do? I'd love to see how that pretzel is straightened out. I don't know if I should go through this again. Is Jesus implying more than that the unrighteous sons of this age are more shrewd than the righteous? They're smarter than Christians. Is he implying that the righteous sons of light should learn to be squirrely like the unrighteous and apply it in their own dealings? It sounds like that to me. I simply don't understand any of this. Uniquely Lucan. Now, this is towards the end of Matthew. The next day, the chief priests and the Pharisees met with Pilate, saying, "Sir, when the deceiver lived," that's Jesus, "he said, 'I will rise after 3 days.' Give orders for the tomb to be guarded until then. Otherwise, his disciples may come, steal him, and say to the people, he's risen from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Okay? This gives us an idea that this was already happening. This was already being said, that he didn't rise from the dead, that somebody stole his body. Methinks you doth complain too much. Shortly after, next chapter in Matthew, men from the guard who were guarding the tomb came and reported to the chief priests all of that had happened. They gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, you are to say, his disciples came at night and stole him while we were asleep. So they're playing both sides. They took the money and did as they had been instructed, and this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. This is uniquely Matthean. Easter morning. Easter morning. Three women at the tomb. 2 women at the tomb. 3 women at the tomb. A young man in white. An angel. 2 men in white. Jesus is not here. They all say it. That's good. Go tell the others. Go tell the others. They tell no one in Mark. End of story. They tell everybody in Luke. Jesus appears and he says, go tell the others, right? Peter goes to sea in Luke. No disciples go to sea in Matthew. It shifts immediately to Galilee. Immediately to Galilee. And Mark, of course, because they didn't tell anybody, is silent. And then there's the guard story that I just read to you, okay? There's the road to Emmaus. Isn't that something? It's purely Lucan. Road to Emmaus. Boy, it's a rabbit hole, right? Jesus appears, Jesus disappears, Jesus reappears again, okay? Then there's the meeting in Galilee, which only exists in Matthew. All this Galilee stuff. And there's no meeting in Galilee in Luke, and there's none in Mark. I thought we were supposed to meet in Galilee. Well, there's only one. Then there's the ascension, right? That's important. That should be in all 3, right? But we know it's not in Mark, and guess what? It's not in Matthew either. It's only in Luke, and it's in Jerusalem, just outside of the city. So you have all of this language that's inside of them, and they're working their way through these things. But one thing that's for sure is Matthew and Luke both solve the problem of the women being afraid and not telling anyone. So it's tough but true how this works. Built upon the Markan Gospel and a significant second source, which we call Q, both the Matthean and Lucan Gospels are anything but particularly unique. While each contained a small amount of unique material, they simply do not stand on their own as anything more than the products of plagiarism of other sources. They're not original. That's harsh, isn't it? That's tough. What else would you call them? How would you treat the other 2 students who copied from the first source? Would you say that their papers were original? Copy A and copy B, are their papers original? No, they copied. Mark and John are the only original Gospels we have, the first and the last one. I remind you that this is an historical approach. History is the study through as many sources as possible of what most likely happened in the past. The supernatural, by definition, is the least likely to have historically happened in any settings. That's a tough thing, but historically it's true. It is the least likely that we would say, Custer and his guys, they weren't really killed by Indians. They ascended to heaven or something. They were killed by Indians at Little Bighorn. The supernatural has absolutely no attestations in the historical record. In the historical record, none. Religion, by definition, is about the supernatural. The assignation of the supernatural to anything becomes an issue of faith. Faith, by definition, is the belief that what you hope is. Not very flowery language, but when you melt down Hebrews and that statement about faith, that's what you get. It's the belief that what you hope is. Feelings are certainly real, but feelings don't make things real, and that would be magic, and we're not magical. We're not magical. At this midpoint in this 5-part series, we've established the earliest gospel in the Christian canon, and it is the Markan gospel. We've established that the Matthean and Lucan gospels are products of at least 2 other sources and are not original documents by any measure. So we've got this, right? Our village square, our 4 eyewitnesses, that's what the traditional language is. Our 4 eyewitnesses. But they aren't. We're left with 2. Mark we've covered, and John is in 2 weeks' time. Next week, week 4 of 5, we'll address the Johannine Gospel, and it's a doozy, isn't it? It is unlike anything else. The Johannine has Jesus making statements after statement after statement that evidently the disciples completely missed in the previous Gospels. Jesus isn't even the same being, hardly, in the Johannine. But guess what? A lot of time has passed. Things develop and grow over time. And this community, somewhere else, this community, the Johannine, they have developed their own stuff, and it is 75 plus years after the crucifixion. It is one of the last contributions to the Christian canon, along with 2 Peter. It's in the 2nd century. Next week, we'll address the Johannine Gospel, or next 2 weeks. Thank you all for coming. Are there any questions? Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes?
I'm a little confused about the Jews.
Yeah?
It's not a thing, we can't go look it up.
No.
So how do we know about it?
If it behaves the same way as the Markan material, if it behaves exactly the same way, and we have all of these parallels over and over and over again in Matthew and Luke, it behaves the same way, as does the Markan material. What can we assume? There's another source. And that's why they call it Q, or Kvela, source. If we didn't have Mark, we would assume it's all Q. But because we have Mark and we can source everything that's Markan in Matthew and Luke to Mark, then the parallels of material acting the same way indicates something else. It can't be coincidence, therefore negating the need for a second source. They can no more be coincidence as the Markan material is coincidence. Yes?
Couldn't Matthew be Q for Luke, or Luke Q for Matthew? I mean, why are we all assuming that it's a third party? Why aren't they? And how about the other 13 Gospels that they never found or never incorporated?
The ones that didn't get in? Yeah, what about those? What about those?
So we're just dealing with the
Whoop.
things we have.
We're dealing with the things that got in, okay? The things that are in. And yet there's so many more Gospels that were written. Lots and lots of them. The Apocrypha is huge. Apocrypha meaning the stuff that didn't make it in. Yeah. So, yeah. Any more? Fire away. Let me have it. Yes.
So the Q community, the other 3 communities, Q is a separate community. And somehow that got lost. But assuming good intentions.
We have to assume,
Maybe Luke or
yeah.
Lucan or the Matthew community thought, geez, ours is so
Q is really the things that predate the narratives are Jesus sayings, collections of Jesus sayings. What they call the Gospel of Thomas, which is apocryphal. It's not a gospel. It is how many? 125 Jesus sayings, sayings of Jesus. And it didn't make it in. It's in the Apocrypha. Q, of course, doesn't exist, but it had to have been written because you can't, oral tradition is not going to give you the identical nature, word for word, that you find if you have it in front of you, a copy of it. So the fact that a copy of something got to the Matthean community 7 years before the Lucan community says there are multiple copies of Q floating around, just as there were copies of Mark floating around. And these two communities happened to get both. And they liked them both. Yes? Yes.
Is there anything that didn't get into the Bible that was written around the time of Mark or before?
The Pauline letters all predate Mark. All of Paul's letters predate Mark. In my opinion, Revelation is also a part of the destruction of Jerusalem because it's warning 7 churches, that if the Romans could do it there, they could do it anywhere. And so my opinion is that it's written in the early 70s as well. Other things, is anything else dated other than Paul before Mark? Bruce, I would have to say no. I would have to say no.
And that's linguistic as well as historical, archaeological.
Yes.
The linguistics all indicate
Yeah.
that they are later.
Yeah. Because as the church develops, even structurally, there's going to be certain words like diakonos, deacon. That's not going to come into being for decades after things. So that if you have a letter that's attributed to Paul and he's talking about diakonos, it sheds a real question mark on whether or not that's original, that's authentic Paul. Because if they're not using that multiple words and multiple phrases and language hasn't been developed yet, it can't be from the 50s if they don't start developing until past the 90s. So this process is building from a very small start. And Paul, 20 years later, just begins writing letters. 1 Thessalonians and Galatians, 50, 51, right in there. But we have a long way to go to Mark, don't we? It's a fascinating thing to study historically. And there's so much in our text, in the Christian canon, in the Jewish Old Testament, our Old Testament, that Hal always says of Isaiah that it's just gobbledygook. Isaiah is a tough slog. It's hard. If you can sit down with it and start to put sections that repeat themselves, like God's condemnation, into banker's boxes, okay? You start to trim it down into who's acceptable in God's opinion, who isn't. Well, it takes 5 boxes for who's not acceptable in God's opinion, and it takes a tiny envelope for who God likes. God likes the Yahwists, those who worship Yahweh, and he doesn't like anybody else. And when you get down, and then you can start trimming this language down. I challenge everybody, pick up Isaiah and start to slog through it and write notes, pay attention. Don't read a book about it. Don't go to Bible studies, because they'll turn it all into that it's all about Jesus. Lord knows we have Handel's Messiah, which is all drawn from Isaiah. But Isaiah is a Jewish prophecy, book of this called a prophet, a Nevi'im, in the Old Testament. Well below, 500 years before all of this. And so slog through it. I challenge you. Pick them up. You got them. Lord knows we all have the time. Except for Jan. He doesn't have the time. Jan's a busy guy. But thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. You know, this is a different way of looking at it. I know that. And I'm not trying to tear down anybody's faith. But sometimes it's important to actually go back and read what it says and look at it not as all being just the same thing, but to notice the differences and notice the commonalities, you know, and ask a few questions. And that helps our faith be alive, I think, in my opinion. So, thank you all so much. I won't see you next week. I believe I will see you in 2 weeks. Is that correct, Bruce? You know everything. Bruce knows everything. If you need to know anything, don't come to me. Talk to Bruce. I'll give you his phone number. Anyway, thank you. Thank you all.